Good evening. We begin tonight with breaking news from the Middle East. Israel has been struck by a second large-scale terrorist attack, eerily reminiscent of the events of October 7, 2023. This new assault, planned and carried out by Hamas and other militant factions, targeted multiple locations across southern Israel in a coordinated offensive. But what is perhaps most alarming is the emerging evidence that many of the attackers were individuals released from Israeli prisons earlier this year as part of a controversial ceasefire deal. In total, Israeli officials report at least 200 dead, hundreds more injured, and several civilians taken hostage once again. The Israeli military has responded with immediate and intense airstrikes, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has declared that Israel is now in a state of war. As the conflict intensifies in the Middle East, the political and social fallout is spreading worldwide. In major cities across the United States and Europe, mass protests have erupted. On university campuses, student activists, many already radicalized by months of anti-Israel and anti-Western rhetoric, have mobilized en masse, with demonstrations quickly turning into clashes with police and counter-protesters. Here in the United States, protests at Columbia University, UC Berkeley, and Harvard have drawn thousands, with slogans such as Global Intifada now and Death to Israel echoing through the streets. Some demonstrators are seen waving Palestinian and even Hezbollah flags, while others openly justify the attack as resistance against oppression. Meanwhile, Jewish students and faculty report feeling increasingly unsafe, with some institutions advising them to avoid public spaces on campus. In Washington, the Trump administration is facing intense scrutiny. With confirmation that released prisoners played a direct role in the attack, critics argue that U.S. foreign policy has catastrophically failed. The president, who earlier this year negotiated the ceasefire deal that facilitated the prisoner release, addressed the nation today, calling the attack unforgivable and reaffirming U.S. support for Israel. But his remarks have done little to quell backlash from both sides of the aisle. Both Republicans and Democrats are calling for a full investigation into how the administration handled the deal, with some even pushing for military action. Meanwhile, progressive lawmakers and activists, many of whom have long been vocal in their criticism of Israel, are now demanding that the U.S. halt military aid entirely, even as Israeli civilians endure renewed violence. As the world watches, intelligence agencies are now warning that this moment could mark a major turning point, not just for Israel and the Middle East, but for Western democracies facing rising extremism within their own borders. Federal authorities are closely monitoring reports that foreign-backed groups may be using the current protests as an opportunity to fuel greater unrest in the U.S. and Europe. Meanwhile, in Israel, the situation is rapidly evolving. The Israeli Defense Forces have announced the launch of a full-scale military operation in Gaza, with reports of ground forces mobilizing. As we speak, airstrikes continue to pound suspected militant targets, and tensions are reaching a boiling point. The coming days will be critical. Will Israel's response be enough to prevent future attacks? How will global leaders react? And will the unrest spreading across the West continue to escalate? This is an ongoing story, and we will keep you updated as new developments emerge. For now, I'm Rachel Matthews, and this has been your breaking news report. Stay with us as we continue our coverage. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. We begin tonight with breaking developments in a rapidly escalating online campaign that national security experts are now calling a dangerous shift in extremist tactics. In what officials are describing as a coordinated effort, an extensive network of pro-Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iranian-linked accounts have launched a social media blitz across multiple platforms, urging followers to move beyond protest demonstrations and take direct action against what they call Zionist and imperialist institutions in the United States. The campaign, which surfaced in early November, has spread across Telegram, TikTok, and X, formerly known as Twitter, where anonymous accounts, often using AI-generated avatars, have posted incendiary messages calling for resistance in the form of lone wolf attacks, sabotage, and coordinated acts of disruption against key American infrastructure. Intelligence analysts say this marks a troubling evolution from prior social media campaigns that primarily focused on rallying protests and influencing public discourse. This time, the rhetoric is different. Explicit calls for violence are circulating in encrypted messaging groups and spilling into mainstream social platforms, often cloaked in vague slogans or coded language. Law enforcement officials are particularly concerned about the way these messages are being amplified. While the origin of the campaign appears to be linked to radical elements in Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran, the narratives are being repackaged and distributed by Western-based activists, some of whom may not fully grasp the real-world implications of the rhetoric they're sharing. Some messages openly celebrate recent attacks against Israeli and U.S. interests abroad, while others instruct followers on how to carry out acts of vandalism, cyber attacks, and even arson, directing them toward symbolic targets such as government buildings, corporate headquarters, and Jewish community centers. This escalation has drawn sharp warnings from U.S. intelligence officials, who say the potential for real-world violence is growing. The FBI and Department of Homeland Security have issued internal alerts to law enforcement agencies nationwide, warning of an increased risk of domestic terrorism inspired by the online incitement. A senior DHS official, speaking on background, told us that investigators are monitoring an uptick in encrypted conversations discussing potential targets and tactics, raising fears that at least some individuals are heeding these calls to action. The White House has also weighed in on the developments. A National Security Council spokesperson released a statement earlier today condemning what they called an organized attempt to incite violence and sow chaos within the United States. The statement affirmed that federal agencies are working with social media platforms to curb the spread of violent extremist content and are prepared to take action against individuals found to be engaging in illegal activity. Meanwhile, social media companies are once again under scrutiny for their handling of extremist content. Despite past efforts to combat terror-related propaganda, platforms like X and TikTok have been slow to remove many of the posts in question, leading to growing criticism from lawmakers and security experts. At the center of the controversy is Telegram, a platform long favored by extremist groups due to its encrypted messaging capabilities and lax content moderation policies. Experts say that Telegram channels affiliated with Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iranian-backed militias have been instrumental in spreading and coordinating these calls to action. Many of these channels have seen a surge in followers in recent weeks, with propaganda videos, instructional manuals, and direct incitements to violence being posted in rapid succession. The use of memes and viral trends to target younger audiences is also a growing concern, as analysts warn that radical elements are increasingly using the language of social justice and anti-imperialism to recruit disaffected individuals. As authorities work to counter the threat, Jewish and pro-Israel organizations across the country are urging increased vigilance. Several synagogues and community centers have already enhanced their security protocols, with some calling on local police for additional protection. The broader geopolitical implications of this campaign cannot be ignored either. With tensions in the Middle East at a boiling point, experts believe that Iran and its proxies are using social media as part of a wider strategy to destabilize Western nations and erode public support for U.S. allies. Iranian state-affiliated media outlets have also been pushing narratives that frame these online efforts as part of a global resistance movement, further legitimizing the rhetoric for those susceptible to radicalization. For now, the question remains, how far will this online campaign go? Officials warn that as long as extremist propaganda continues to spread unchecked, the risk of violence on American soil will remain high. Law enforcement agencies are urging the public to report any suspicious online activity and to remain aware of potential threats in their communities. This is a developing story, and we will continue to bring you updates as they unfold. Stay with us for the latest developments on this growing security concern. Good evening, I'm Rachel Matthews, and we begin tonight with a developing story out of New York City, where a Jewish community center was the target of a deadly terrorist attack earlier today. The attack, which law enforcement is calling a coordinated assault, unfolded just after 11 a.m. Eastern Time, when multiple armed assailants stormed the facility, opening fire on staff and civilians inside. The attack, horrifying in its execution, was live-streamed by the attackers themselves, echoing past incidents of extremist violence. According to authorities, the assailants, believed to have been inspired by ISIS and Palestinian militant groups, had planned the attack for weeks, releasing online manifestos prior to the assault. These documents referenced the so-called Global Intifada, a term used by extremist factions to justify acts of terror against Jewish and Western targets. The attackers explicitly blamed the United States for what they called Zionist crimes, drawing connections to ongoing tensions in the Middle East. Eyewitnesses describe a chaotic scene as the heavily armed individuals stormed the building, firing indiscriminately. "I heard gunshots, screaming, people running. It was absolute terror," one survivor told reporters. Within minutes, a massive law enforcement response was underway. NYPD counterterrorism units, along with federal agencies, swiftly engaged the suspects in a high-stakes standoff. By early afternoon, all attackers had been neutralized, though not before lives were lost. Officials have not yet released a confirmed death toll, but sources indicate multiple casualties, including innocent civilians and possibly law enforcement officers. Authorities are now investigating potential links between the attackers and foreign terrorist organizations, as well as whether they had local support. Security officials are also on high alert, monitoring for potential copycat attacks. Meanwhile, Jewish communities nationwide are reinforcing security measures, fearing that today's assault could signal the beginning of a larger wave of extremist violence. President Trump has condemned the attack in the strongest terms, vowing to bring to justice anyone who had a hand in this horrific act of terror. Speaking from the White House, the president reaffirmed the administration's commitment to protecting all American communities from extremism. Tonight, as New York grieves, there are growing calls for increased counterterrorism measures, particularly to address radicalization efforts occurring online. Law enforcement is urging the public to remain vigilant and report any suspicious activity. We will continue to bring you updates as more details emerge. Stay with American News Outreach for the latest developments on this tragic and deeply unsettling event. Back to you. Good evening. We begin tonight with breaking news across multiple American cities, where what began as mass demonstrations in solidarity with the so-called Global Intifada has escalated into outright violence. Radicalized factions, including elements of Antifa, remnants of the Black Lives Matter movement, and Islamic extremist groups, have coalesced under this Intifada banner, launching attacks against Jewish institutions, Israeli-owned businesses, and police precincts. Authorities are struggling to contain the growing unrest, and federal agencies are now considering an emergency response. What you're seeing here is live footage from downtown Los Angeles, where multiple fires have been set, and police report that synagogues and businesses with ties to Israel have been targeted by rioters. Witnesses say masked individuals carrying Palestinian flags and banners calling for resistance began looting before setting buildings ablaze. This scene played out earlier today in Chicago, where a mob stormed a Jewish-owned grocery store, vandalizing the shelves and assaulting employees. Videos circulating on social media show participants chanting anti-Zionist slogans, with some voices heard calling for Intifada, a term historically linked to violent uprisings against Israel. Law enforcement confirms that these attacks appear to be coordinated through encrypted messaging platforms like Telegram and Signal. In New York, a group identifying itself as the Intifada Defense Collective has issued a statement claiming responsibility for a series of firebombings against synagogues and police stations. The group, which appears to be a loose alliance of left-wing anarchists and radicalized Islamist factions, says their mission is to dismantle Zionist and imperialist control within the U.S. FBI officials are now investigating potential foreign connections, with growing concerns that funding and tactical support may be coming from organizations tied to Hamas, Hezbollah, or even Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. As seen here in footage from Philadelphia, a police precinct was firebombed late last night, with officers forced to evacuate under heavy assault. This follows a wave of attacks on law enforcement over the past week, with radical factions labeling American police as enforcers of Zionist oppression. Federal authorities are now mobilizing counterterrorism units to track key figures behind these violent cells. Meanwhile, Jewish communities across the country are calling for increased security measures, fearing that synagogues and community centers will remain prime targets.
We are living in fear. Our businesses, our places of worship, our very homes are under attack. We never thought we would see this kind of hatred reach American streets at this scale, but here we are. We need protection, and we need it now.
The people have had enough. This is our resistance. The Intifada isn't just for Palestine, it's for every oppressed people fighting against the Zionist empire. We will not stop until the oppressors fall.
These words, and the escalating violence, have drawn sharp responses from state and federal officials. The National Guard has already been deployed in at least 3 major cities, and there are growing calls for domestic counterinsurgency measures to dismantle these radicalized networks before the violence spirals further out of control. We will continue to monitor this situation closely and bring you updates as they come in. Stay safe and stay informed. Good evening. We begin tonight with a wave of violent attacks that have swept across multiple American cities in what officials are calling a coordinated lone wolf terror campaign. These assaults, inspired by online radicalization and anti-Israel rhetoric, have left communities in mourning and authorities scrambling to assess the full scope of the threat. We warn our viewers, some of the footage you are about to see is disturbing. The most devastating attack occurred in Los Angeles, where a driver intentionally plowed into a crowd outside a pro-Israel demonstration. 12 people were killed, including children and elderly attendees. Authorities confirmed the suspect, a 28-year-old with a history of online extremism, was inspired by radicalized social media content. Law enforcement sources tell us they found encrypted messages on the suspect's phone linking him to extremist Telegram channels promoting Global Intifada rhetoric.
Make no mistake, this was an act of terrorism. The suspect deliberately targeted a peaceful demonstration with the intent to kill as many people as possible. This is a direct result of extremist propaganda encouraging violence on our soil.
Meanwhile, in Chicago, a masked attacker stabbed an Orthodox Jewish man in broad daylight before disappearing into the crowd. Surveillance footage captured the suspect, dressed in black, approaching the victim from behind and striking multiple times before fleeing. Let's take a look at that footage. The victim, a 52-year-old father of 3, is in critical condition. Chicago police say the attacker used a makeshift weapon, potentially a box cutter or a homemade blade. No arrests have been made, and the suspect remains at large. And in a deeply disturbing pattern, multiple Jewish schools across the country have been set ablaze in apparent arson attacks. Fires broke out at institutions in Florida, Texas, and California, with investigators suspecting coordinated efforts. Authorities are examining whether these attacks are linked to the growing online campaign urging violence against Jewish communities.
This wasn't just vandalism. This was meant to send a message, to terrorize us. My son's classroom is gone. We got lucky this time. What if they come back?
These attacks mark the first major escalation of what security analysts are calling a global intifada movement taking root in the U.S., inspired by a combination of radical Islamist propaganda and far-left militant activism. This movement is pushing individuals toward acts of terrorism. Federal agencies are now monitoring a surge in encrypted online chatter urging further violence. FBI Director Kash Patel addressed the nation today.
This is not spontaneous. These acts of terror are the result of a deliberate effort to radicalize individuals in the United States. We are witnessing the digital spread of violent extremism, and we will not allow these threats to take root in our communities.
Security experts warn this is just the beginning. Online extremist networks have been ramping up calls for violence since last year, and recent conflicts in the Middle East have only fueled the fire. With protests growing more radical and law enforcement stretched thin, the concern now is what comes next. Will we see an escalation beyond lone wolf attacks? Could organized cells begin operating on American soil?
We've seen this before. Lone wolves are often the opening act. These attackers are testing law enforcement responses, spreading fear, and laying the groundwork for more sophisticated operations. If we don't act now, we could see coordinated bombings, mass shootings, or even targeted assassinations in the near future.
For now, Americans are being urged to remain vigilant. Authorities are increasing security at places of worship, Jewish-owned businesses, and public events. But the question remains, are we ready for what comes next? We'll continue our coverage as this developing situation unfolds. Stay with us. We'll be right back after this break. Good evening. We begin tonight with breaking news from Washington, D.C., where a night of music and celebration turned into horror. A well-coordinated terrorist attack, reportedly carried out by Hamas and Hezbollah-affiliated operatives along with domestic radical leftist extremists, has left at least 120 dead and dozens more injured at a concert venue near downtown. Authorities are calling it one of the deadliest terrorist incidents on American soil since 9/11. This was the scene just moments after gunmen stormed the venue, opening fire indiscriminately on the crowd. Witnesses describe a nightmarish situation. Heavily armed attackers entered the building, executing concert-goers at close range and holding others hostage. Authorities say they were met with return fire from law enforcement before the final gunmen were neutralized in a dramatic shootout. Authorities are now working to piece together exactly how this attack was planned, and more importantly, how these terrorists made their way into the country. Early reports suggest that several of the attackers crossed the U.S.-Mexico border illegally in recent months, potentially exploiting weaknesses in national security to infiltrate American cities. Intelligence officials had previously raised red flags about suspected Middle Eastern operatives using cartel-controlled smuggling routes to enter the country, but tonight's attack underscores just how severe that threat has become. Sources indicate that the attackers coordinated through encrypted messaging apps, possibly taking direct inspiration from previous mass casualty attacks such as the 2015 Bataclan massacre in Paris. In a chilling parallel to the Bataclan attack, survivors say the terrorists shouted extremist slogans before opening fire on the crowd. One witness describes the moment she realized what was happening.
They just started shooting. They weren't robbing anyone, they weren't making demands, they just wanted to kill as many people as possible. They were shouting stuff about Palestine, about Zionists. I tried to hide under a seat, but they were going row by row, just executing people.
The FBI, Homeland Security, and local authorities are now investigating the attackers' affiliations. Officials believe this could be part of a broader wave of terror attacks dubbed the Global Intifada, a movement that has been gaining traction in radical left-wing and jihadist circles over the past year. Tonight's attack is just the latest escalation in what some analysts are calling a low-level insurgency forming inside the United States. In the past months, Jewish community centers, synagogues, and pro-Israel rallies have been targeted in acts of violence. Now, intelligence officials fear that radical leftist groups and foreign terrorist networks are converging to bring large-scale terror to American cities. We are now learning more about the attackers themselves. At least 2 of them were known to authorities, with ties to radical activist groups in the U.S. One of them, identified as Jamal al-Masri, had previously been arrested for participating in violent protests but was released without charges. The other, Omar Haddad, entered the U.S. illegally last year and was flagged by border officials but ultimately released due to current immigration policies.
We have long warned that terrorist groups would exploit our weakened border security. This attack proves that the threat is not hypothetical, it's happening now. We need decisive action to secure our borders and prevent further infiltration.
The White House has released a statement condemning the attack, vowing swift action to prevent further incidents. President Trump is expected to address the nation later tonight. As the country mourns the victims of tonight's attack, many are left asking, how did we let this happen? Could this have been prevented? And what will it take to ensure that Americans are safe from the growing threat of radicalized violence? Our coverage continues with expert analysis on what this means for national security, the role of foreign terror networks, and the broader implications of radical extremism taking hold on American soil. Stay with us as we bring you the latest updates throughout the night. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. We begin tonight with breaking news of a dangerous new extremist group that has emerged within the United States. Calling itself Intifada United States or IUS, the coalition of radical leftists, anarchists, and Islamist extremists has claimed responsibility for a wave of violent attacks on government buildings and law enforcement facilities. Authorities are scrambling to respond, and the FBI has officially labeled the group a domestic terrorist organization. The group, reportedly inspired by Palestinian uprisings of the past, has already carried out multiple bombings in key cities. Their targets: police stations, federal courthouses, and other government institutions. Let's take a look at the latest attack in Washington, D.C., where a federal building was struck by an explosive device late last night. This was the scene at 2:17 a.m. when an explosive device detonated outside the IRS headquarters here in the nation's capital. Witnesses describe a loud blast that shook nearby buildings and sent debris flying across the street. No casualties have been reported, but the damage to the building is extensive, and authorities are now treating this as a coordinated terrorist act. The attack in Washington is just one of several across the country. Cities like Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles have also seen similar bombings, all following the same pattern: late-night explosions targeting symbols of federal or local authority. Officials say IUS is using encrypted online channels to spread propaganda and recruit new members. The FBI has launched a nationwide manhunt, urging the public to stay vigilant.
We are dealing with a well-organized, highly radicalized group that is actively targeting the institutions that uphold law and order in this country. We are urging citizens to report any suspicious activity and to avoid spreading unverified information that could aid the perpetrators.
But just who are the people behind Intifada United States? Experts say the group appears to be a hybrid of extremist factions, some with ideological ties to anarchist movements, others to Islamist militancy. Intelligence analysts believe the group's leadership operates through decentralized cells, making it difficult for law enforcement to track their activities.
What makes IUS so dangerous is its ability to unite ideologically disparate groups under a common cause, opposing the U.S. government. They are leveraging social media and encrypted messaging apps to coordinate attacks, much like ISIS or other past terror organizations.
In response to the escalating attacks, the Department of Homeland Security has raised the national terror threat level, and counterterrorism units have been deployed in major cities. The White House is expected to address the situation in the coming hours. For now, officials are urging calm but say they will use every available resource to dismantle this new domestic threat. As this situation develops, we will continue to bring you the latest updates. Stay with American News Outreach for ongoing coverage. Up next, how social media is fueling extremist movements and what platforms are doing to crack down on terrorist propaganda. Stay with us. Good evening. We begin tonight with a developing national security crisis. December 2026 has brought an unprecedented wave of coordinated attacks on U.S. infrastructure, intelligence officials now confirming links to Iranian-backed sleeper cells operating within the country. Authorities are scrambling to assess the full scale of the damage as emergency response teams work to restore critical services. The most devastating attack so far occurred in the Midwest, where a major fuel pipeline was bombed overnight. The explosion sent fireballs into the sky, causing widespread fuel shortages and price spikes at gas stations across multiple states. Officials fear it could take weeks to repair. Here's what we know so far.
This was a deliberate act of sabotage, and we are treating it as a terrorist attack. We are working with federal and local partners to ensure the security of our nation's energy infrastructure and to prevent further incidents.
Meanwhile, in what appears to be a coordinated assault, power substations in both New York and Texas were attacked, leading to rolling blackouts in several major cities. The Department of Energy has deployed rapid response teams, but residents in some areas are being warned of extended outages. In New York City, commuters found themselves in chaos as traffic signals went dark and subway services faced disruptions. Similar scenes played out in Houston, where temperatures dipped below freezing overnight, leaving thousands without heating.
I woke up, and everything was out. No heat, no lights. We tried to get gas for a generator, but the stations were either closed or packed. It's like nothing works right now.
And it's not just physical infrastructure under attack. A wave of cyber attacks targeting American financial institutions has sent shockwaves through Wall Street. Banking systems have been disrupted, and stock markets have been in turmoil for days.
This is the worst cyber assault on U.S. markets we've ever seen. Hackers flooded systems with malicious code, causing trading halts and financial losses in the billions. The federal government and private sector are scrambling to contain the damage.
With tensions rising, President Trump addressed the nation earlier today, vowing swift retaliation and reinforcing security measures across the country. As investigators work to unravel the full scope of these attacks, authorities are urging the public to remain vigilant. We will continue to bring you the latest updates as this situation unfolds. Stay with us for further coverage after the break. Good evening, I'm Rachel Matthews, and tonight we bring you a troubling development. A growing number of military-aged men, radicalized through social media and encrypted messaging platforms like Telegram, are traveling to the Middle East for so-called training, only to return to the U.S. What does this mean for national security? And what, if anything, can be done to stop it? We begin with an inside look at how these individuals are being recruited and why officials say the threat is rising. Federal intelligence officials say online radicalization is nothing new, but the pace and scale of recruitment have surged in the past year. Encrypted channels promote militant ideology, while influencers push propaganda that portrays travel to conflict zones as a rite of passage.
We're seeing these men being recruited under the guise of self-defense training or preparing for an inevitable conflict. They're lured in by flashy content, combat footage, testimonials, even promises of brotherhood and purpose. But the concern is what happens when they return.
Homeland Security sources confirm that multiple individuals suspected of receiving paramilitary training abroad have returned to the U.S. in recent months. Officials warn that while not all of them will act, some may pose a long-term security risk.
We are monitoring these cases very closely. Our primary concern is individuals returning with combat experience, operational knowledge, and connections to extremist networks.
Federal and local law enforcement have already made several arrests linked to this trend. In one recent case, a 29-year-old man from Ohio was taken into custody after allegedly attempting to provide material support to a foreign militant group. Authorities say he had traveled to Syria last year for training and returned with plans to recruit others.
I mean, I never would have suspected anything. He was quiet, kept to himself. But looking back, yeah, he did start talking a lot about the government and being ready for something big.
Lawmakers are now calling for stricter measures to prevent radicalized individuals from leaving or re-entering the country. Proposed solutions include enhanced screening of travelers, increased surveillance of online extremist spaces, and expanded counter-radicalization efforts. As officials race to respond, the question remains, how do you combat an enemy that recruits in the shadows, trains overseas, and then blends back into American life? We'll continue following this story as new developments unfold. For now, I'm Rachel Matthews. Stay with us for more coverage, and coming up next, a look at the growing concerns over AI-driven disinformation campaigns, how they're shaping public perception in 2027. Good evening. America's cities are in crisis. What began as isolated attacks has escalated into a full-scale insurgency, with coordinated violence gripping major urban centers like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago on a weekly basis. Radicalized factions, operating under the banner of the so-called Global Intifada, are carrying out sustained, organized assaults on police stations, government buildings, and critical infrastructure. The result? Urban war zones where law enforcement is outmatched, and civilians live in fear.
There's explosions and gunfire going on down the street.
Authorities say these attacks are highly organized, with groups using encrypted messaging apps to coordinate movements. Every weekend, new targets are hit: courthouses, police precincts, even power substations, plunging parts of these cities into darkness. Many law enforcement officials are now privately admitting they are losing control. In Chicago, coordinated arson attacks have left entire blocks in ruin, while in Los Angeles, armed factions have taken to shutting down major highways, blocking emergency response teams. With law enforcement agencies stretched thin and demoralized, the federal government has been forced to step in, but even with increased National Guard deployments, the violence continues. Meanwhile, residents are fleeing in record numbers. Families who have called these cities home for generations are packing up and leaving, citing the growing instability and lack of security. For those who remain, everyday life is a struggle with food shortages, power outages, and an overwhelming sense of fear. Government officials are scrambling to respond, but the political divide over how to handle this crisis has only deepened. Some call for a massive federal crackdown, others argue that a heavy-handed response could fuel even greater unrest. But with no end in sight, one question remains: how long before these cities become completely ungovernable? As the crisis deepens, we will continue to bring you the latest updates. Coming up after the break, we'll speak with counterterrorism experts on what this means for the future of American security. Stay with us. Good evening. It is now being called the deadliest terror attack on American soil since 9/11. Tonight, Manhattan is in lockdown after a highly coordinated assault by Hezbollah-linked terrorists who, alongside local militant cells, launched a Mumbai-style attack across the city. Just after 7:45 a.m., multiple armed teams emerged in Midtown, opening fire on civilians in Times Square, Bryant Park, and Grand Central Terminal. Witnesses describe scenes of panic, bodies in the streets, and gunmen moving with chilling precision. Police sources confirm at least 3 improvised explosive devices were planted in major transit hubs, including the Port Authority bus terminal and Penn Station. One device detonated during the morning commute, causing mass casualties. The other 2 were disarmed by the NYPD bomb squad. Governor Jameson has declared a state of emergency, activating the National Guard, who were deployed by 10 a.m. to secure transit infrastructure and assist in urban operations. As of this hour, Manhattan remains under curfew. Authorities believe the attackers were affiliated with Hezbollah and may have received logistical support from Iranian-backed cells in the U.S. Homeland Security has confirmed at least 2 of the assailants crossed the southern border in early 2026, part of what intelligence officials now call a sleeper migration. The attack is part of what some experts are calling a global intifada, a transnational insurgency targeting Western cities. Over the past year, similar plots have been foiled in London, Toronto, and Paris. As the death toll climbs past 120, with over 400 injured, hospitals are overwhelmed. The NYPD reports that at least 11 attackers have been killed, with 3 suspects still at large. Tonight, the heart of America's largest city feels like a war zone. Streets once filled with tourists are now silent, except for the sounds of helicopters and armored convoys. We'll have more on this developing story throughout the hour. Good evening. It's October 23, 2027, and tonight we begin with a special report that's raising alarm across the country, the emergence of so-called no-go zones inside U.S. cities. These are neighborhoods where local authorities say they are increasingly unable, or unwilling, to enforce American law, ceding effective control to armed radical groups. Federal and local officials have confirmed the existence of at least 3 such zones in Michigan and Minnesota, with others reportedly forming in Illinois, New Jersey, and Southern California. In these areas, radical Islamist groups, some with ties to foreign terror networks, are enforcing what they call community law. In parts of Dearborn and Minneapolis, residents report that men affiliated with extremist mosques and militias are conducting street patrols, issuing punishments, and even operating underground courts. Police sources tell us that entering these enclaves now requires coordination with state or federal tactical units. The situation has drawn comparisons to similar enclaves in Europe, parts of Brussels, Paris, Malmö, where radical groups operate with de facto autonomy. Critics say it's the result of years of failed integration policies, lax immigration enforcement, and political reluctance to confront religious extremism. But law enforcement isn't just dealing with ideology, it's also facing firepower. A leaked DHS memo reveals that some of these groups have obtained military-grade weaponry, possibly smuggled in through cartel routes at the southern border. Meanwhile, residents are caught in the middle. Some, especially women and religious minorities, report intimidation, forced conversions, and retaliation for cooperating with U.S. authorities. Federal agencies have pledged a coordinated response, but critics say the delay has already allowed these zones to entrench. As the broader Intifada United States movement escalates, questions are mounting: who is really in control of America's cities? Good evening. We begin tonight with a nation in crisis. What began as a coordinated day of rage protests in over 20 American cities has escalated into the worst wave of domestic unrest in modern U.S. history. Late yesterday afternoon, demonstrations quickly spiraled into violence. Protesters, some armed, many masked, clashed with police in Portland, Seattle, and Los Angeles. In what authorities now describe as a coordinated escalation, armed radicals stormed several government buildings on the West Coast, including the federal courthouse in downtown Seattle. In Portland, City Hall was briefly occupied by insurgents bearing symbols linked to the militant group Intifada United States, or IUS, which has claimed responsibility for at least a dozen attacks since last year. Even more disturbing, coordinated sniper attacks targeting law enforcement were carried out in Dallas and Atlanta. Police sources confirm at least 14 officers dead and dozens wounded after what one official called an urban ambush. Then, the horror deepened. Just before the evening commute, multiple bombings rocked subway systems in both New York City and Washington, D.C. The attackers struck within minutes of each other, clear signs of advanced planning. At least 300 people are confirmed dead, with hundreds more injured. President Trump has declared a national state of emergency. The Department of Homeland Security has elevated the threat level to critical, warning of potential follow-up attacks in the coming days. We are now in what federal agencies are calling the most dangerous domestic insurgency since the Civil War. The attackers are a loose coalition of radicalized elements, some foreign-trained, many homegrown, fueled by extremist ideologies ranging from jihadism to far-left insurrectionism. As we process the scale of today's violence, we are reminded that this is not just a moment, it is a movement. One that law enforcement, intelligence officials, and communities across the country must now confront together. We will continue our coverage throughout the hour. Good evening. I'm Rachel Matthews, and tonight, the nation braces for a new chapter in the domestic crisis that has gripped America for over 2 years. In a stunning and unprecedented move, the Trump administration has invoked emergency powers under the Insurrection Act, deploying federal troops and declaring martial law in multiple regions across the United States. The official statement from the White House cites the escalating wave of urban insurgency, rising casualties among law enforcement, and what the administration calls domestic terror networks aligned with foreign adversaries. But the move has sparked outrage across the political spectrum and on the streets. Critics, especially from left-leaning media and civil liberties groups, have condemned the crackdown as the dawn of what they call American fascism. That language is being echoed by growing factions of radical activists who are using the government's heavy-handed response as fuel for recruitment. Our investigative teams have found evidence that online recruitment for radical insurgent groups has spiked in the past 48 hours. Telegram channels affiliated with Intifada United States and newly emerging militias have seen surges in membership. Many of these groups are calling this a turning point, a justification to escalate armed resistance. Federal intelligence officials, speaking to us on background, admit that while the martial law zones may slow the violence temporarily, they fear this move could radicalize an entire generation of disaffected youth, particularly in urban areas and among those already exposed to extremist propaganda. As we enter this critical moment in the American crisis, the question remains, will force restore stability, or will it deepen the divide? We'll continue to follow this story as it unfolds, minute by minute. Stay with us. Good evening. Tonight, we begin with a major turning point in what the White House is now officially calling the Global Intifada. After nearly 3 years of escalating urban violence, terrorist attacks, and social unrest, the United States military has been deployed for sustained operations inside the homeland. March 2028. A date that will be remembered as the moment the U.S. government shifted from containment to direct retaliation. With terrorist cells operating openly in major metropolitan areas, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Houston, the Pentagon authorized Special Forces raids on domestic soil for the first time since the Civil War. Delta Force and Navy SEAL teams, working alongside the FBI's hostage rescue unit, have begun targeting known terrorist hubs, including safe houses and weapons caches in so-called no-go zones from previous phases of the conflict. These operations are being classified as counterterrorism raids, not police actions. Sources within the Department of Homeland Security confirm that more than 150 high-value targets were neutralized or captured in the first week alone. Many are believed to have direct ties to foreign groups including Hezbollah, the IRGC, and Hamas, but increasingly, intelligence points to a homegrown insurgency, radicalized online and trained abroad. But the government's retaliation hasn't come without backlash. Footage of military operations in American neighborhoods has sparked outrage on social media. Civil liberties groups are already calling this a dangerous precedent, one that blurs the line between military defense and martial law. At a press briefing today, Pentagon spokesperson General Rachel Ingram stated bluntly, "The gloves are off. We are no longer playing defense." According to leaked documents obtained by our team, the government's response includes preemptive strikes, cyber shutdowns of suspected radical networks, and an expanded drone program within U.S. borders, an unprecedented move. Already, major transit hubs are under lockdown. Civilian movement in and out of red zones now requires federal authorization. Curfews have been reinstated in 11 states. And in Washington, a newly proposed Domestic Anti-Terrorism Act is facing bipartisan scrutiny for its controversial surveillance provisions. From protest chants to active firefights in American streets, this so-called Global Intifada has entered a grim new chapter, one where the battlefield is not halfway across the world, but in our own neighborhoods. When we come back, how communities are coping with the new normal, and what it means when your city becomes a war zone. Stay with us. Good evening. We begin tonight with a dramatic and unprecedented shift in domestic security policy. It is June 2028, and several U.S. states, led by conservative governors, have officially authorized the deployment of armed citizen militias to assist law enforcement in active counterinsurgency efforts. In an announcement this morning, the governors of Texas, Florida, Idaho, and several other states invoked emergency authority to deputize registered citizen militias, citing what they describe as an ongoing domestic insurgency tied to radical ideological networks. This move follows years of escalating violence, bombings, and targeted assassinations attributed to the loosely coordinated movement known as Intifada United States. Law enforcement officials say they are stretched beyond capacity. Over 300 officers have been killed since last summer alone. Now, local militias, many of whom have military or law enforcement backgrounds, are being embedded in joint task forces. Their mission: support urban clearing operations, defend key infrastructure, and track suspected insurgent operatives. Critics have warned this move could fuel further unrest. Civil liberties groups are sounding alarms over accountability, racial profiling, and the growing militarization of civilian life. But supporters argue that with national police forces overwhelmed, and with radicalized networks continuing to carry out coordinated attacks, these militia units are a necessary stopgap. Sources tell us that the Department of Homeland Security is closely monitoring these developments, though federal officials have yet to intervene. The question now, is this a bold defense of law and order, or the opening act of a new kind of American civil conflict? We'll have more after the break, an exclusive interview with a former FBI agent who says we're witnessing the collapse of traditional law enforcement doctrine in real time. Good evening. We begin tonight's broadcast with breaking developments out of the Middle East that are now sending shockwaves across the globe. Just hours ago, U.S. intelligence agencies released a classified report, now made public, officially linking the Islamic Republic of Iran to the arming and funding of insurgent forces responsible for dozens of attacks on American soil over the past year. These insurgents, many operating under the banner of Intifada United States, have carried out coordinated bombings, assassinations of police officers, and cyber attacks crippling financial systems. And now, for the first time, Washington is pointing the finger directly at Tehran. Within minutes of the announcement, U.S. fighter jets were already in the air. Tonight, American F-22s and B-2 stealth bombers have launched a series of retaliatory strikes on Iranian military installations believed to house drone factories and weapons depots used to supply insurgents. The strikes hit multiple IRGC compounds near Kermanshah and Isfahan. Iranian state media is already calling it an act of war, vowing retaliation. In Tehran, crowds gathered in the streets, chanting anti-American slogans and burning U.S. flags. With tonight's events, what began 3 years ago as isolated domestic unrest, sparked by overseas conflict, has now escalated into a true international crisis. Global markets are reeling. Oil prices surged 18% in after-hours trading. NATO has called an emergency session for tomorrow morning. From the first acts of sabotage in 2026 to the declaration of martial law earlier this year, to now, direct military conflict with a foreign state sponsor, the conflict dubbed the Global Intifada has reached an entirely new level. In the days ahead, the U.S. may face not only an intensifying insurgency at home, but potentially a broader regional war in the Middle East. The question now, how far is Washington willing to go to stamp out the threat, and what will Iran's next move be? We'll continue tracking this breaking story. Coming up next, how major U.S. cities are preparing for potential retaliatory attacks, and the rising threat of cyber warfare on America's critical infrastructure. Stay with us. Good evening. I'm Rachel Matthews, and this is your evening report. Tonight, new developments in America's long and grinding counterinsurgency war. After more than 3 years of sporadic domestic terror attacks, assassinations, and military operations on U.S. soil, December 2028 has marked a turning point. Over the last month, U.S. Special Operations have conducted precision raids across multiple states, eliminating or capturing at least 6 high-level leaders of the so-called Intifada United States, including suspected masterminds behind the 2027 Manhattan transit bombings and the Dallas sniper attacks. Officials say this marks the largest disruption of insurgent command networks since the conflict began in late 2025. Yet while the insurgency appears to be fracturing, the violence has not ended. Just last week, a courthouse bombing in Phoenix left 4 injured and reignited fears that despite leadership losses, sleeper cells and radicalized individuals remain capable of mounting deadly attacks. Analysts say we are now entering what they call the fragmentation phase, where centralized leadership gives way to scattered, ideologically driven violence. Intelligence reports suggest that factions within the insurgency are turning on each other, blaming one another for tactical failures and ideological betrayals. Some former allies have even begun leaking locations of rival cells to authorities. This internal chaos has sparked what some officials fear could evolve into a cycle of intergroup purges and splinter factions with even less centralized control, and potentially, even more erratic behavior. As 2028 ends, the insurgency may be fracturing, but America remains on edge. The question now is not whether the war is ending, but what comes after. Stay with us for continuing coverage. I'm Rachel Matthews. Good night and stay safe. Good evening. Tonight, we mark a pivotal turning point in what has been one of the darkest chapters in modern American history. The so-called Global Intifada, which began nearly 4 years ago, is now officially waning, its once coordinated networks dismantled by a sustained federal crackdown. It started with global outrage over renewed conflict in the Middle East. What began as protests spiraled into something far more violent, an unprecedented fusion of radical leftist, Islamist, and anarchist ideologies under one banner. The result: years of bombings, assassinations, cyberattacks, and bloody street warfare. Over the last year, federal agencies, including the FBI, DHS, and Joint Special Operations Command, have led aggressive operations to dismantle the insurgency. Over 3,000 suspects have been arrested. Dozens of high-ranking organizers, many trained abroad, have been neutralized. Intelligence officials believe the centralized command structure of Intifada United States has been broken. But the damage has been done. Over 10,000 casualties. Hundreds of terror incidents. A national sense of trauma not felt since the early 2000s. And while the larger networks have collapsed, urban violence, especially in cities like Seattle, Philadelphia, and Detroit, remains entrenched. Law enforcement officials warn that while the coordinated insurgency has faded, localized cells and ideologically motivated violence are likely to persist for years, possibly generations. As one senior DHS official put it, "We may have ended the war, but we haven't won the peace." While many celebrate the end of large-scale attacks, others fear what could come next, a simmering low-grade insurgency. A permanent low boil of violence, as some analysts describe it. The nation moves forward, scarred, but standing. The global intifada may be over, but its shadow lingers. We will continue to report on its aftermath. For now, stay safe, stay vigilant, and good night. Tonight, a nation transformed. The war at home may be over, but what's left in its wake? From militarized streets to sweeping new laws, we examine America in the aftermath of the Global Intifada. Good evening. I'm Rachel Matthews. It's April 2nd, 2030. 5 years ago, the so-called Global Intifada set off a wave of unrest, terrorism, and ultimately, urban warfare across the United States. Now, as the smoke clears, the country has entered what security experts call the final phase, and the landscape, both politically and socially, is almost unrecognizable. By 2030, national security and counterterrorism are no longer just part of the conversation, they are the conversation. The political realignment in Washington is complete. Democrats and Republicans alike now campaign on promises of security, surveillance, and swift retaliation. Legislation passed in late 2029 officially criminalized what lawmakers call ideological insurgency networks. Islamism and radical leftism, once seen by some as fringe political ideologies, are now treated as national security threats. New laws target not just actions, but affiliations, funding sources, and even digital communication patterns. In America's urban centers, a new normal has taken hold. Police forces have adopted counterinsurgency strategies modeled after military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Surveillance drones patrol the skies. AI-driven facial recognition systems monitor movement in real time. In January, the U.S. government declared the Global Intifada officially over. But few believe the threat has truly vanished. Sporadic attacks, mostly lone wolf in nature, continue to surface, particularly in cities once considered insurgency hotspots. Meanwhile, civil liberties groups warn of a permanent state of exception. Critics argue the nation may have won the war on terror, but at the cost of democracy itself. With free speech zones, restricted movement, and predictive policing algorithms, many question whether the America of 2025 still exists. And so, as the global intifada fades into memory, the United States steps into an uncertain future, forever shaped by years of unrest, retaliation, and reinvention. For now, the guns are quiet, but the scars of the conflict remain etched into the nation's streets, its politics, and its identity. Good night.